Hey guys, tonight we're heading way back to a time when the wheel was still a hot new invention and receipts weren't yet those annoying little pieces of paper cluttering your wallet. You're in ancient Mesopotamia now. It's dusk, and the dusty orange light of the setting sun glints off mud brick walls as you trudge through the narrow streets of Ur, one of the earliest cities on Earth. The air is thick with the smell of burnt sesame oil, wet clay, and maybe just a hint of goat. You can hear a distant chant rising from the ziggurat temple. Children chase each other barefoot across the market square, weaving between baskets of onions, bolts of linen, and jars of date syrup. There's something timeless about this scene. You're not carrying a phone. You're not wearing a watch. You're not even sure if your sandals match. But you are holding something precious. Soft, freshly cut clay, still damp and cool in your palm. You're on an errand. A temple clerk needs this clay to jot down today's grain rations. And you're just the tired apprentice who delivers the mud. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing the global bedtime crew. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pause at the corner where the alley widens just slightly. A potter is packing up for the day, scraping the last bits of slip from his wheel. A scribe's assistant hunches over a low wooden table, working by torchlight, his reed stylus tapping clay like rain on a rooftop. He barely looks up as you pass. This is normal. This is every day. You're walking through the hum of economic life in the 21st century BCE. Trade, exchange, temple offerings. It all flows through these streets like water through canals. And yet, what's missing here is what keeps modern economies from spiraling into chaos. A record. A way to prove that you gave your neighbor 3 goats for 2 sacks of barley. A way to hold someone accountable when they forget to return your borrowed ox. But don't worry, that's coming. In fact, you're about to witness the dawn of the receipt. The smell of fresh bread wafts out from a low clay oven, reminding you that commerce isn't just about big stuff. Land, cattle, taxes. Sometimes it's about dinner. And in this corner of the world, food is often both currency and record. A loaf of barley bread might be payment for a day's labor. A jug of beer might count as an offering to the gods, or your boss. Maybe both. Historians still argue whether the first receipts were created for religious offerings or commercial trades. Some say it was temple economies that needed to track every bit of barley and every drop of oil. Others insist it started with personal trades, neighbor to neighbor, under the wary gaze of a suspicious goat. What's not in dispute is this. Mesopotamia was the world's first paperwork society, not just because they loved writing, but because they had to. Their cities were complex. Their trade network stretched across rivers and deserts. And their memories? Well, probably about as reliable as yours after a long nap and no coffee. The street narrows again. You pass a guard napping upright beside the temple gate, his spear leaning lazily against the wall. Inside, the temple courtyard bustles in contrast. A priest chants over a mound of grain. A young woman tallies the jars of beer being loaded onto a cart. And off to the side, seated at a low bench beneath an awning, is the head scribe. He motions you over. You present the clay. He gives a grunt of approval and doesn't thank you, but you didn't expect him to. Rank has its privileges. He smooths the clay, dips his stylus into a little pot of water, and begins to press. Not write, press, because Mesopotamian writing isn't cursive or looping or airy. It's punched in, like a series of small, deliberate dents. Each mark is a wedge-shaped impression, thus the name cuneiform, from the Latin cunus, meaning wedge. You watch his practiced hands move. Press, press, drag, press. The marks aren't random. That triangle, it means barley. Those repeating dashes, that's the number 5. He finishes the tablet, adds the temple's official seal with a quick roll of a carved cylinder, then sets it on a shelf to dry. Receipt complete. You stifle a yawn. Not because you're bored. Okay, a little because you're bored, but mostly because this place has a kind of dreamlike rhythm to it. Things move slowly, intentionally. Everything has weight, from the heavy clay to the gravity of every tiny wedge pressed into it. There's a beauty to the simplicity of it all. This tablet you just watched being made. It might outlast your own childhood drawings by a few thousand years, because unlike paper, clay hardens, clay survives, and once this receipt is dry, it will be filed, maybe reread, maybe never touched again, until some modern archaeologist finds it and says, "Ah yes, 5 sheep, 2 jars of oil, 1 somewhat cranky scribe." You find a quiet spot beside the temple wall and sit. A dog trots past, tail up, mouth open in a doggy grin. Somewhere in the distance, a lyre plucks a lullaby over the rooftops. You can't help but think of how this moment, so small and mundane, is also historic. You're watching humanity's first awkward steps into record-keeping. Not for glory, not for literature, just for the daily grind, receipts, rations, IOUs, and maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it worth remembering. You stretch your legs and continue down the alley, following the smell of crushed dates and donkey sweat toward the edge of the marketplace. The streets of are winding, but your feet know the way. Every stall you pass hums with trade, loud bargaining, muted grumbles, 1,000 transactions, each one entirely undocumented, at least for now. In this part of town, deals are still sealed with eye contact, a grunt, and, if you're lucky, a solemn handshake. There's an unwritten rule here. If your cousin says you owe him a chicken, you probably owe him a chicken, maybe even 2. The word of your neighbor is law, unless he's lying, in which case you'd better be really good at shouting. This is what trade looked like before receipts. No tablets, no scribes, just your word, your memory, and a rather fragile social contract. You duck past a hanging canopy of woven reeds to find 2 men haggling over a load of wool. One is waving a spindle dramatically. The other gestures toward a suspiciously lumpy sack. Their goats watch with total indifference. It's not hard to imagine how this could go wrong. What if one forgets the terms? What if someone claims to have paid and didn't? What if the goats unionize? And yet, somehow, it mostly works. These are small communities, bound together by kinship and gossip. Everyone knows everyone's business. If you cheat someone, your aunt will hear about it before lunch. There's pressure to be honest. Not from a receipt, but from your grandmother's disapproving frown. Historians still argue whether these pre-written economies were more moral or simply more afraid of embarrassment. Some argue that early trade worked because everyone was embedded in a tight social web. Others suggest that fear of divine retribution, those all-seeing Mesopotamian gods, was enough to keep you from stealing your neighbor's grain. Still, it's not exactly scalable. As cities like and Eridu ballooned in population, word-of-mouth accounting just couldn't keep up. Imagine trying to remember 47 individual fish trades without writing anything down. You'd forget by lunchtime, especially if you'd already eaten the fish. You stop to watch a woman measuring lentils with a clay scoop. The buyer frowns, insists on a second scoop. There's a pause, then a nod. A deal. No record, no proof, just trust. You scratch your head. It's not that different from splitting a dinner bill with friends and hoping someone else remembers what they ordered. Except in this case, if you forget, you might owe someone a goat for the rest of the season. Nearby, a man squats beside a low basket of figs, telling an animated story to a group of children. He gestures wildly with one hand and, with the other, accepts a fish in exchange for a handful of fruit. He tucks the fish into a sack and keeps talking without missing a beat. No notebook, no signature, just pure confidence. That's the thing. Trade without records depends on rhythm. It's a dance of memory and trust. But once you step out of that rhythm, Say, you trade with someone from another village, or you lend grain to a stranger. Suddenly, your word might not be enough. And that's where things get interesting. You make your way past the fig seller and into the quieter residential lanes. The buildings here lean into each other like sleepy old friends. Laundry flaps lazily overhead. Somewhere, a baby wails. Somewhere else, a rooster forgets what time it is. You stop in front of a modest home. A man is sitting on his stoop, carving something into a palm-sized piece of clay. Not a tablet, just a crude lump, scored with a few lines. He looks up and grins. "Debt," he says in a dialect you halfway understand. "Brother-in-law." You nod. Of course. Even without formal receipts, people try to keep track. You can't afford not to. Clay is cheap, memory is slippery, and brother-in-laws, even more so. In some early communities, traders use pebbles or strings as physical markers. 1 pebble per sheep, 5 knots for a bundle of reeds. These little stand-ins were probably stored in baskets or pouches, a proto-accounting system you could carry in your belt. Like an abacus for livestock, but it wasn't perfect. Lose your pouch and suddenly you owe someone 3 cows, maybe more. And besides, pebbles don't explain who made the deal or when or why, just the numbers. It's like finding a wallet with cash but no ID. You've got part of the story, but not enough to avoid awkward conversations. So people started experimenting. Tiny clay figures shaped like commodities, cones for grain, spheres for oil. These were slipped into hollow clay balls called bulli, sealed up, and marked with a personal symbol on the outside. Trade proof, sealed and signed. Kind of like stuffing a receipt into a piggy bank and smashing it open when needed. You reach a bend in the road where the first stars start peeking out overhead. The moon hangs low, lazy and swollen. A caravan passes in the distance, jingling with rope bells and camel snorts. You imagine how chaotic it must have been, trying to track dozens of trades with no standardized record. Maybe that's why the bully caught on. Maybe people were just tired of arguing over who owed whom a jar of pickled onions. And so, slowly, the world began to change. You can almost feel it, somewhere between the goat trades and the fig swaps. There's a spark, a need, a moment when someone, somewhere, decides they're done trusting their brother-in-law's memory. They want something solid, something they can point to. And just like that, the idea of a receipt is born. Not yet the written kind, not yet the tablet, but close. You cradle the thought like warm clay in your hands. It's humble, it's messy, but it's coming. You wake early, before the sun rises. The sky is a soft indigo, and the city of is still wrapped in silence, save for a distant bleating sheep and the rhythmic thud of a grain grinder somewhere nearby. Today, you're accompanying a merchant. Not just any merchant, one of the big ones. He deals in livestock, which means he's got carts, assistants, and an alarming amount of animal hair in his sandals. You meet him at the city gate, just as a caravan arrives from the north. Donkeys bray, drivers shout. The whole place smells like wet wool, dust, and distant ambition. Your merchant has a system. Before anything is loaded or traded, he squats down and pulls out a small sack. From it, he spills a handful of tiny clay tokens onto a flat stone. Each one is carefully shaped, cones, discs, little spheres, each representing a specific good. 1 cone equals a sack of grain, a sphere, a jug of oil. It's not art, it's accounting. This is the system that came before writing. It may not look like much, but these tokens are the seeds of civilization's great paperwork obsession. And here you are, watching it sprout. Your merchant counts 10 cones and 3 spheres. He lines them up neatly. A helper double-checks. Then, without ceremony, they drop them into a hollow clay ball, a bula. Once inside, they seal it shut, smoothing the surface and stamping it with the merchant's personal seal. A quick roll of a carved cylinder, and there it is, the Mesopotamian version of a signed contract. No stylus, no cuneiform, just clay on clay. Historians still argue whether these bulli were invented for trade between strangers or for internal temple use. Some think they served as honor boxes, a way to store agreed-upon values until both parties could return and verify. Others suggest they were used more like shipping manifests, tracking what was loaded, sent, and received. What's agreed upon, though, is that they were genius, practical, portable, and, most importantly, tamper-evident. If someone tried to break it open to mess with the tokens, it was obvious. Kind of like trying to reseal a letter with chewed gum. You follow the merchant to a buyer's compound, where another set of tokens is waiting. They compare bully, they laugh, they bicker, and finally, they nod in unison. A deal. Later, back at his home, the merchant opens the bulla and removes the tokens to double-check. The count matches. The goods were received. Another bulla might be made to confirm it, or maybe they'll just let it slide, depending on how trustworthy the caravan driver looks. You squat beside a sleepy apprentice and inspect the tokens. They're oddly satisfying. Smooth, small, easy to fidget with. Like ancient fidget toys that also happen to represent large-scale economic agreements. And here's the real kicker. The tokens don't just help you count goods. Over time, people start using them to record trades. First, they press the tokens into soft clay before sealing them inside. That way, if the bulla breaks, the impression is still there. Brilliant, right? Then someone somewhere gets an idea. What if we just skip the tokens? What if we press the shape straight into a flat piece of clay and call it a day? And just like that, the idea of a receipt takes its final form. You're looking at the literal moment history tilts. The token impressions evolve into abstract marks, symbols that no longer represent physical objects, but agreed-upon values. It's no longer a physical token, but a symbol for a token. That's the dawn of symbolic writing. That's the birth of cuneiform. You lean back, dizzy from the enormity of it. What started as a handful of knucklebone-shaped lumps in a bag has now become the seed of writing systems. Not poetry, not song, but math, counting, debts, the humblest, most practical origin imaginable. It's like realizing the first spreadsheet was carved into mud. Your merchant offers you a drink, a bitter beer made from partially fermented barley. It's sour, warm, and a little chunky, but after all that counting it somehow tastes divine. He chuckles and pulls out a small, flat tablet, the kind you've seen scribes use. He traces the edges with a fondness usually reserved for favorite tools. Soon, he says, even small traders like him will learn to press numbers into clay themselves. No more bully, just flat tablets. Numbers, symbols, written proof. Of course, he adds, you'll still have to trust the math. And the scribe. You smile. It seems humanity has always needed receipts, not because we don't trust each other, but because we don't trust ourselves. We forget, we fudge, we borrow and swear we'll pay back, then pretend we didn't say that part. These clay balls and tokens, they're insurance against our own memory. A quiet acknowledgement that I said so might not hold up in court, or at the next market stall. The sky is dark now. Torches flicker along the rooftops. The day's transactions have all but wrapped, and somewhere in the city's archive chambers, dozens of clay bullae sit cooling in silence. Tiny, palm-sized monuments to someone's sheep, someone else's barley, and a civilization's budding obsession with accuracy. And as you walk home, your head full of spheres and cones, it's hard not to wonder. What weird little objects from your daily life will become sacred relics 5,000 years from now? You're back in the temple district again, the next morning. Squinting at a small clay ball the head scribe has just cracked open with a tap from a polished obsidian blade. The air smells of sun-warmed mud and something slightly sour. Fermented dates, maybe. A line of merchants waits behind you, each holding similar spheres. Inside each bulla, tokens, tiny promises sealed in clay. But something different happens today. The scribe doesn't simply nod and toss the fragments aside. Instead, he picks up a second tablet, flat, rectangular, already smoothed, and begins pressing wedge-shaped marks into its surface. You step closer, curious. He's not using the tokens directly. He's copying their meaning, translating clay shapes into symbols. Just like that, the clay ball is demoted. The flat tablet takes over. You're witnessing the moment when Mesopotamia invents the filing cabinet. These new tablets are easier to store, easier to stack, and, crucially, easier to read without smashing anything. One shelf in the temple now holds hundreds of them, each a transaction frozen in time. And as you help organize them into neat rows, you notice a shift in tone. The language of these receipts is changing. Less pictorial, more abstract. Not a cone for grain, but a sign representing grain. Not 5 spheres, but 5 horizontal wedges. The system is evolving. Cuneiform is becoming a true script. Historians still argue whether this shift from tokens to tablets was gradual or sparked by a sudden administrative need. Some bureaucratic panic involving too many goats and not enough shelves. But however it happened, the end result is clear. The tablet replaces the token, and the idea of recording abstract values becomes normalized. And the most common thing being recorded? Grain. You pick up a tablet and squint at the markings. It's a ration list. 12 liters of barley for a temple worker, another line for a brewer, yet another for a singer at last week's full moon ceremony. You smile. Even in ancient times, musicians got paid in beer ingredients. Nearby, a young apprentice organizes freshly pressed tablets onto drying racks. He moves quickly, but his arms are streaked with clay, and there's a wild-eyed look that suggests he's memorized too many signs today. You try not to laugh, because not long ago you were that guy. The thing about these receipts is, they're not just accounting. They're the foundation of Mesopotamian bureaucracy. Tax records, temple distributions, trade logs, debt agreements, even marriage arrangements. It's all here, written in lines and wedges, baked into silence. You overhear a debate between 2 scribes. One insists the new sign for beer should have 3 vertical wedges. The other argues that's confusing, because that's also how you record ox. They mutter, argue, smudge. Eventually, someone scribbles over it and starts again. It's a reminder. Written language wasn't born finished. It was messy, evolving, full of crossed-out marks and frustrated sighs. And those early receipts? They're barely legible without years of training. You sit beside a more patient scribe, who lets you try your hand at deciphering one. It reads something like 6 shekels of barley delivered to Enlil-Z for temple duty, verified by witness Lu-Sin. Simple maybe, but potent. It means Enlil-Z has proof of payment. It means Lu-Sin can't pretend he wasn't there. And it means whoever runs the temple kitchen now knows where the grain went. Accountability, baked into clay. You glance down a long row of tablets, shelf after shelf of them, and feel the full weight of it. These aren't just receipts. They're a record of trust, of ownership, of daily life. Each one an attempt to say, this happened. I was here. One particularly heavy tablet catches your eye. It's thicker than the rest, with denser writing and a surprisingly intricate seal. The scribe hands it to you carefully and explains that it's a master copy, used to verify disputes. If someone claims they were shorted on barley or never received their wages, this is the tablet they consult. You run your fingers across the grooves, feeling the impressions like braille from 4,000 years ago. Somewhere, some poor laborer once squinted at this exact piece of clay and said, "See, I told you I worked Tuesday." Another tablet is drying nearby, freshly stamped. It records the trade of a cart of onions for a goatskin tunic. A dull transaction, perhaps, but it's what gives these tablets their charm. They're not filled with epic poetry or grand conquests. They're filled with onions and tunics, the bones of real life. There's even a tablet with a crude drawing. 2 stick figures, one slightly taller than the other, handing over a round object. Probably beer, maybe bread. Could be a joke. It's hard to tell. But it's a reminder that humanity has always enjoyed scribbling a little nonsense between serious notes. You help stack the dried tablets onto shelves, and for a moment you feel like a librarian of the most boring but essential truths. The receipts aren't beautiful, but they're necessary. They make the invisible visible. They capture what's easily forgotten. And more than that, they're the first real signs that humans, for all their chaos, kind of want to be honest. Or at least, they want to avoid arguments. By the time you step back outside, the sun is high. The city buzzes with motion again, and you realize that from this point on, the world is never going back. The clay ball is fading. The flat tablet is king. Receipts are here to stay. You're resting in the narrow shade of a crumbling courtyard wall. The midday heat pressing down like a wool blanket soaked in steam. Across from you, a pair of young scribes are taking turns practicing cuneiform, muttering symbols under their breath, while nudging each other like schoolchildren. One of them is carving a familiar sign, a triangle pressed into the clay with a flat stylus tip. You recognize it immediately. Grain. Not the word grain as you'd know it today, but a symbol. A tidy stylized wedge mark that stands for the thing itself. It's one of the first signs children learn in Mesopotamian scribe school, because it's one of the most important things the entire civilization runs on. Barley, to be exact. Not wheat, not rice, just good old dependable barley. You're going to see that triangle a lot. Barley is money, barley is tax, barley is lunch. You sip a warm water from a goatskin pouch and watch the young scribes practice. They press the same signs over and over. Barley, oil, fish, bread. There's no poetry here. No epic tales of war or love. Just inventory. But it's beautiful in its own way. A language built not for art, but for survival. And when you think about it, of course, grain got its own icon. You can live without a chariot. You can live without a temple song. But you miss 2 grain deliveries, and suddenly half your workers are passed out under the date palms. Historians still debate which signs came first. Some think the earliest pictographs were directly linked to the tokens, pressed shapes evolving into drawn shapes. Others argue that once scribes got styluses in their hands, they began inventing new shortcuts, new abstractions, like a kid turning hamburger into a doodle of a bun and 2 squiggles. What they do agree on is that writing didn't start with stories. It started with lists. Not myths, not songs, but grain. And those first lists, they weren't written to entertain. They were written to solve problems. You need to feed 120 workers. You've got 340 jars of beer. You need to deduct 1 ox per month for temple maintenance. Congratulations. You now have a reason to invent an accounting language. You stroll over to the students, crouching down to get a better look at their tablets. The clay is still soft, and the lines are fresh. One tablet records a delivery of barley to a brewer. Another lists items given to a caravan leader, possibly as part of a diplomatic gift, or just to make sure he doesn't run off with the donkeys. You notice the stylus they're using, an angled reed cut precisely for wedging shapes. You try to borrow it, but the student gives you a skeptical side eye. Fair. Clay tablets aren't cheap. And cuneiform isn't just about poking marks. It's about angle, pressure, stroke order. If you press too hard, you get a blob. Too soft, a ghost mark. And if you smudge your sign for fish, someone ends up getting paid in frogs. One student shows you his practice tablet. It's not bad. You compliment his wedge spacing. He beams with pride and accidentally drops it in the dirt. Classic. You pick up another clay scrap nearby. Someone's discarded list of temple inventory. Oil, grain, 1 bronze knife, 1 very annoyed goat. Okay, maybe not the goat, but the list is real. And what's fascinating is that you can already see shorthand developing. A single complex sign might now stand for a whole phrase. What used to take 10 tokens now takes 1 squiggle. That's progress, baby. And like any progress, it breeds confusion. You overhear 2 temple officials arguing quietly over a delivery tablet. One insists the symbol for half jug was written incorrectly. It's too short, too angled, too much like the one for duck. The other insists it's fine. And anyway, no one's getting a duck from him this week. This is the real problem of the early written word. It's not standard. Not yet. Every region, every scribe, even every temple might have slight variations. It's like trying to read someone else's shorthand grocery list and ending up with 15 loaves of soap. Still, the system works. Kind of. It's clumsy, inconsistent, and absolutely essential. The triangle for grain becomes one of the first sight words in Mesopotamian life. You see it everywhere. Carved above storerooms, scribbled onto ration tablets, etched beside temple doors. It's not just a symbol, it's a cornerstone. You wander into a quiet storage area behind the temple, a long, narrow room lined with sealed clay jars. Some are marked with cylinder seal impressions, tiny rolling images that declare ownership. Others have little tablets tied to their necks with string. Inventory labels, tagging the ancient world, one pot at a time. You pause before one jar. Its tag reads something like, Year of the Great Flood, 20 jars, temple use only. Overseer, Ninkal. You smile. Even with the rough edges of early writing, you can feel the rhythm of bureaucracy taking root. And all of it, from temple stores to sheep deliveries, relies on that one little triangle for grain. The sun begins to sink again, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. You sit with your back to the cool wall, eyes tracing the signs in the soft clay nearby. Triangles, dots, lines, each one part of the slow, deliberate march toward literacy. Not for poetry, not yet, but for barley. Because what good is civilization, really, if no one knows who still owes you dinner? You're awake before the rooster today, an impressive feat in any era, and already making your way toward the temple courtyard. It's scribe training day, and someone thought it would be funny to volunteer you. Your hands are clean, your sandals are mostly intact, and your brain still half asleep. Perfect candidate. You find yourself seated cross-legged on a woven mat, surrounded by clay lumps and overly chippered teenage scribes. The instructor, a stern-faced man with permanently ink-stained fingers, hands you a stylus, a sharpened reed, flattened on one end, angled just enough to press those trademark wedge shapes into soft clay. You stare at it like it's a scorpion. This is your first real encounter with writing, Mesopotamian style. Not just watching it, doing it. And let's be clear, it's harder than it looks. The clay tablet before you is a modest slab, roughly the size of a postcard and twice as temperamental. It's been freshly cut from a larger brick, and it still smells faintly of riverbank. Cool, damp, and oddly comforting. Like the ancient equivalent of cracking open a new notebook. You dip the stylus into water to soften the strokes, then start pressing. Carefully, slowly. You try to mimic the instructor's neat little wedges, but yours come out looking like bird feet doing a tap dance. The triangle for grain becomes a blob. The symbol for fish looks like a very tired star. A young apprentice leans over to peek. He makes a sound somewhere between a chuckle and a cough. You respond with a universal gesture. You try writing with no coffee. The scribe instructor doesn't scold you, though. He just nods grimly. Everyone starts this way, he says. Even the great scribes of the king's court once made chicken scratches in clay. You nod in solemn agreement while secretly trying to scrape your last mistake off the tablet with your fingernail. Doesn't work. Once it's pressed, it's pressed. Historians still argue whether early scribes were truly literate in the way we think of today, or if they were more like advanced list makers, human spreadsheets with fancy titles. What we do know is that training was intense. Years of memorizing signs, practicing stroke order, and copying the same basic rations list over and over until you could press it in your sleep. And you will press it in your sleep, trust me. You look around the room. The other students range in age, but all have the same clay-streaked elbows and permanent squint of someone trying to distinguish between ox and wild ox without messing up a contract. A few are practicing on sand trays before moving up to real clay, a kind of scratch pad for people without the budget for tablets. You're assigned a standard exercise. Copy the day's temple ration tablet. 6 entries: barley, oil, fish, onions, beer, bread. You stare at the symbols carved into the example slab. Then back at your tablet. Then back at the slab. Okay, deep breath, stylus down, 1 mark at a time. The process is meditative, in a strange way. Press, drag, press, breathe. Your thoughts start to slow. The clamor of the marketplace fades. All that remains is clay, your hands, and the rhythm of the wedges. You get into it. You actually get into it. You press the line for 2 jugs of beer with something approaching pride, then realize you accidentally wrote 2 broken donkeys. Oops. Still, progress. The instructor wanders by and gives a slight nod. Not approval exactly, but not outright disappointment either. In ancient scribe school, that's basically a standing ovation. You start to understand why scribes were so highly respected in Mesopotamia. This isn't just about writing. It's about order, memory, precision. A single error can mean the difference between a worker getting lunch or getting fired, or getting extra onions, which is a bigger deal than you'd expect. Even kings deferred to scribes when it came to logistics. You may wear a crown, but if you can't remember how many goats your cousin borrowed last solstice, someone has to set you straight. You finish your first full line without disaster. The wedge marks are uneven, sure, and your barley symbol still looks vaguely like a turtle, but you did it. You wrote something. You captured a moment. You translated reality into shapes. You're given a fresh tablet to try again. And this time, you actually enjoy it. It's not just writing. It's sculpting, pressing, weaving thought into earth. There's something weirdly satisfying about making symbols by touch instead of ink. No erasers, no delete key. Just clay, stylus, and commitment. You look down the corridor where more advanced students are inscribing legal agreements under supervision. A few of them sit with traders, recording land sales and delivery logs. One scribbles rapidly as a priest dictates donations made during last week's moon festival. Cows, bread, 1 golden fishhook, the usual. A whispered rumor drifts past. One scribe made a mistake in a shipment record last week and got assigned manure duty for 2 days. You suddenly grip your stylus a little tighter. Even so, you're starting to see the appeal. Scribes were the keepers of knowledge, the organizers of chaos. And when you realize how fragile memory can be, how easily a spoken agreement can dissolve into air, writing feels like a miracle. You wrap up your lesson by rolling your tablet gently onto a woven mat to dry. The symbols still glisten with damp clay. Maybe no one will ever read it. Maybe it'll crumble tomorrow. But still, for now, it's real. You made something permanent. Well, semi-permanent. A couple hours in the sun or a quick tumble into a bonfire, and it's eternal. As the temple bell sounds and the students pack up, the instructor pulls you aside and points to a larger tablet hanging near the entryway. A masterwork. Perfect spacing. Clean lines. Every symbol crisp and true. You stare, half in awe, half in exhaustion. Someday maybe, but for now, your wonky barley blobs will do just fine. The sun has already started to melt into the horizon, slinging long shadows across the streets as you step out from the scribe hall. Your fingers are caked with drying clay, your back mildly protesting from hours of hunched concentration. And yet, you feel something close to satisfaction. Maybe even, dare we say, pride. But don't get too comfortable. You've been summoned to assist with something a little more official. Turns out your little scribal apprenticeship wasn't just a quirky diversion. You're now deemed competent enough, barely, to shadow a mid-level record keeper during a real transaction. Real clay, real money, real tension. You're headed to a merchant's stall at the edge of the temple district. It's where grain traders, potters, and livestock dealers gather to bicker over barley prices and stare at each other like cats ready to pounce. The air smells like hot stone and goat sweat, with just a hint of cumin and desperation. Your job? Assist in drafting a receipt. Not the kind of receipt you're used to, of course. There are no ink ribbons, no thermal paper curling in your wallet, no accidentally long CVS scrolls with 6 coupons you'll never use. This is the first receipt, as in a literal clay document, recording that someone gave someone else a very specific something, and both parties are now, to use the technical term, not allowed to lie about it later. The merchant you meet is hunched, with a beard like a damp broom and hands like root vegetables. He greets your supervising scribe with something between a nod and a snort. The item in question? 2 full measures of barley, 1 goat, and a set of fishhooks. Payment for a month of temple guard services. You blink. That's your rent invoice, basically, except with more livestock. The transaction unfolds slowly. First, a verbal agreement. Everyone confirms what was promised, when it was delivered, and how fresh the goat was upon arrival. Still slightly annoyed, in fact. Then, your scribe mentor begins composing the receipt tablet aloud. Each clause is spoken clearly, deliberately, like casting a spell. And in a way, that's exactly what writing was to ancient Mesopotamians. A sacred act. If it's written, it exists, not just physically, but spiritually. A truth given shape. You press the tablet yourself this time. Carefully, slowly. You carve the date, the merchant's name, the weight of the grain. You pause at the goat. It's got its own measurement unit, which you absolutely do not remember. The scribe gently corrects you, murmuring the proper wedge shape like a lullaby. You fix it. Not pretty, but accurate. Once the entire transaction is transcribed, the merchant inspects the tablet. He even pokes one of the wedge marks to test the clay's softness, like checking a pie for doneness. Finally, he nods. A clay cylinder, like a seal, is pressed into the corner. His personal mark. It's a little icon that looks suspiciously like a duck wearing a hat. But you don't ask questions. Identity branding was different back then. Historians still debate how formalized these receipts were. Some argue they served strictly economic purposes. Others suggest they acted more like binding social contracts, early forms of what we'd now call notarization. There's even evidence some temple receipts were baked after final approval, essentially making them tamper-proof. Fire-hardened truth. Today's tablet is left to dry in the shade, destined for a shelf in the temple's accounting room, unless it rains, or someone drops it, or the goat comes back and eats it. Fragility is part of the magic. As you follow the scribe back through the market, you pass a stall where another apprentice is copying receipts onto tiny clay cones. These are for mass distributions. Bread rations, mostly. The cones are handed out to workers, who then redeem them at the granary. You raise an eyebrow. Loyalty punch cards, 2300 BCE edition. You also hear murmurs of a merchant dispute last week, where someone tried to reuse an old receipt to claim extra oil. The forgery was spotted immediately. Different stylus, different wedge angle, sloppy wedge drag. Turns out every scribe has a signature stroke. You're basically developing a clay fingerprint. That's comforting and terrifying. By the time you return to the temple, your brain is pulsing with wedge marks. You dream in cuneiform, in tiny triangles and crooked lines and clay spirals. But here's where things get really wild. In one darkened corner of the archives, beneath stacks of hardened tablets, lies a small flat piece no larger than your palm. It's older than most, baked to the point of nearly crumbling, and it contains something different. Not a receipt, not a list, a story. At first you think it's a mistake. Who writes fiction on accounting tablets? But there it is. A short tale, written in archaic symbols. Something about a fox, a vineyard, and a clever trick involving fermented dates. Historians still argue whether early scribes were allowed to embed jokes or fables within formal records, or whether this was just the work of one bored apprentice who had too much clay and too few goats to count. Either way, it hits you. Once you teach someone to write, even for the dullest of reasons, they eventually start to tell stories. Receipts were only the beginning. You blink down at the tablet. The fox's antics trail off in a crumbled corner, lost to time. But you smile anyway. Someone, thousands of years ago, decided that numbers weren't enough. That records should also whisper, entertain, and maybe, just maybe, make you laugh. You carry that idea with you as you leave the archives, your fingers brushing dust from your tunic. You're not just learning to write, you're learning to remember. The sun creeps lazily over the baked skyline as another morning yawns into being. You've barely had your barley mash when you're summoned again. No time for pondering fermented date riddles this time. The temple has a backlog of receipts that need filing. Not writing, filing. Ah yes, the glamorous world of ancient administration. A mountain of hardened clay tablets, each the shape and weight of a flattened potato, and all of them must be sorted, stacked, categorized, and shelved. You shuffle into the archive chamber. It's cooler here. Thick mud brick walls keeping the heat out. Dust motes suspended in shafts of light like tiny, aimless scribes themselves. The scent of baked clay and dried reeds hovers in the air, mingling with something sour that might be old goat cheese. You're not sure. You don't want to know. This is the inner sanctum of Mesopotamian bureaucracy. Hundreds of clay receipts line the wooden shelves. Some are labeled with tiny tags pressed with symbols. Some are marked with cylindrical seals. And some are, frankly, a mess. You eye one half-cracked tablet with a scowl. No date, no name. Just a scribbled cuneiform note that seems to say something about lone sickle, slightly bent. Who even borrows a sickle? Your supervisor gives you a tired look and hands you a long wooden box. Inside are more tablets, recently dried. You're to begin by organizing them by month, transaction type, and client name. Basically, the Mesopotamian equivalent of updating a spreadsheet without Ctrl+F. The process is slow, repetitive, but as you sift through the clay fragments, patterns begin to emerge. You start to recognize recurring names, certain merchants, regular laborers, recurring temple buyers. There's Aramu the fisher, always exchanging nets for oil. There's Belit, who seems to have a goat-based side hustle. There's even a frequent customer listed as servant of Nanshi, who pays for bread with fish hooks and salt. Pretty decent currency, honestly. You spot the same clay seal cropping up across multiple entries, an etched lion with a very judgmental expression. It belongs to a grain distributor who apparently has serious trust issues because he insists on signing every receipt himself. One tablet draws your attention more than the rest. It's a bit thicker, with unusually tight writing. The transaction? A boat rental. The terms? 1 day's use, provided the vessel is returned without damage. The price? A jar of beer and 2 loaves of barley bread. Historians still argue whether this kind of arrangement was casual bartering or part of a larger economic contract system. Some suggest early receipts evolved into proto-legal documents, enforcing accountability through shared record-keeping. Others think they were more like passive reminders, a kind of communal memory carved into earth. Either way, you can't help but grin. Renting a boat for beer feels oddly relatable, minus the clay paperwork. Later in the day, you're asked to carry a bundle of tablets across the courtyard to the high scribe. He's situated near the temple's main entrance, perched at a raised desk and flanked by 2 younger apprentices who look like they haven't slept in a week. You know the look. He waves you over, unrolls a parchment-like scroll made from beaten reed fibers, not for writing, but for reference, and asks you to help cross-check recent entries. One transaction stands out, a huge grain delivery to a neighboring city-state, Lagash. The receipt details weight, method of transport, even the names of the oxen that pulled the cart. Namtar and Sticky. Not kidding. This is where the stakes start to feel higher. These aren't just petty trade notes. Some receipts hold diplomatic weight. A single mistranslation could spark a resource dispute. And if you accidentally confuse a 50 measures of wheat with 15 measures of wheat, Congratulations! You just invented your first ancient lawsuit. And that's not even the weird part. One tablet refers to a tax exemption issued for Festival of the Seven Bowls, a local celebration involving song, food, and what sounds suspiciously like competitive drinking. The exemption: no barley tax for any household that donates a loaf to the temple kitchen during the festival. Weird fringe detail: the loaf had to be triangular, not round, not square, triangular. Why? Historians still argue over that. Some say it was symbolic of fertility. Others claim it had to do with cooking efficiency on triangular hearthstones. Or maybe some tax collector just really liked triangles. The deeper you get into the records, the more you realize something. Receipts aren't just boring entries. They're stories. Tiny freeze frames of someone's day. Who gave what? To whom? Why? And more often than not, the why is where things get interesting. Here's a tablet about a man paying off a debt not in grain, but in 6 painted beads and a promise to clean the irrigation canal. There's one about a brewer who's fined for watering down her product. There's even one cryptic entry that just says, "Returned the donkey," with regret. What happened to the donkey? Was it injured, stubborn, emotionally unavailable? You'll never know. But the clay remembers. Your back aches. Your hands are sore. The sun is sliding toward evening again. You shelve the last tablet, careful not to smudge the seal. As you step outside, the city is humming with sounds. Vendors shouting, sandals slapping, donkeys arguing with no one in particular. You look back at the archive and realize this isn't just a dusty filing cabinet. It's the beating heart of the city's memory. A clay-baked brain, storing every barter, promise, and regrettable donkey. You've handled receipts from grain trades and funerary services, from love offerings to fish exchanges. And while you may not have a stylus of your own yet, you've begun to see how writing wraps itself around life, pressing meaning into mud, one wedge at a time. The temple scribe finally gives you a nod of respect today. Not a grin, not a full smile, just a tight, satisfied nod. It's the Mesopotamian equivalent of "good job, kid." You'll take it. You've graduated from stacking receipts to something more advanced. Drafting a record of your own, a real one. No practice tablet, no squishy trial clay. You've been asked to document a transaction involving a minor temple ceremony. A 2-day moon festival that somehow requires 10 jugs of beer, 3 bundles of incense, and 1 borrowed musician. A man named Tupi, who insists on being referred to as Master of Reeds. You set to work, smoothing a blank tablet to the right oval thickness. Preparing your stylus. Today, a sleek reed cut at a fine angle, and beginning the painstaking, rhythmic process of impressing symbols into the damp clay. First, the date. It's based on the moon's position, of course, and the reigning king's regnal year. You note it carefully, trying not to smudge as you write. Year of the 3rd moon under King Rimsin. Sounds dramatic, sounds expensive. Then the goods. 10 jugs of beer. You could almost smell the mash. 3 bundles of incense. Fragrant, imported from far to the east. Likely paid for with livestock or textiles. And Tupi, the reed musician, whose name you spell cautiously, because the last time someone got it wrong, he refused to perform for a whole lunar cycle. Sensitive guy. You etch it all in, slowly, deliberately. There's a pattern to this. A trance, almost. You're not just recording objects. You're translating reality into symbol. Time into shape. This is how memory beats death. Or so the old scribes say. Midway through your carving, a temple worker comes running in with a clay tablet, cradled like a newborn. It's cracked, hastily dried, and smudged from travel, but urgent. A delivery dispute. 2 ox drivers are at each other's throats in the courtyard over whether 3 sacks of lentils were offloaded or 4. You're asked to compare the new clay note with older receipts. Cross-check, find the inconsistency, settle the fight before one of the oxen gets dragged into it. You do so with quiet precision, scanning rows of tiny wedges. And sure enough, there it is. The delivery was for 4 sacks. but the overseer only initialed 3 on the ledger tablet. Clerical error, or lazy thumb. You correct the record, issue a second tablet noting the discrepancy, and send the runner back out with both. You've just solved your first logistical crisis. Your reward? A slightly less stale flatbread at dinner. The temple uses a tiered system of clay administration. Minor receipts like these are bundled weekly and pressed into large, summary tablets, which outline whole trends. How much grain entered the storehouses, how much beer left them, who's in debt, who's paid up. Sometimes these summaries get their own summaries. Bureaucracy within bureaucracy. The Sumerians didn't just love paperwork, they invented it. There's even a term for a certain type of record, Nik2Ka9AK, or bound obligation, meaning a debt or promise officially recorded. These clay promises carried weight, like a notarized agreement today. You owe barley, it's on clay. Want it wiped. Pay it back or die of shame and social exclusion. Either way. But here's where things get oddly poetic. Sometimes, receipts were deliberately broken once a debt was fulfilled. Cracked in half, thrown into the kiln's discard pile. Like burning a contract, but slower and more dramatic. A kind of ritual forgetting. You see it happen this afternoon. A priest burns sweet reeds in the courtyard and smashes a tablet with his foot, while chanting something about balance returned. Apparently, a family paid back their barley loan early, and now their burden has been lifted, both spiritually and financially. Historians still debate whether these destruction ceremonies were widespread or unique to specific temples. Some argue they were merely symbolic. Others suggest they were binding legal closures. Either way, it's oddly satisfying to hear a tablet snap clean in two. Of course, not all clay gets destroyed. Some tablets are preserved intentionally, especially those with royal seals or references to the gods. One of your fellow apprentices brags that he handled a tablet signed by the high priest and stamped by King Rimsin himself. It concerned the movement of 50 sheep across city boundaries. 50 sheep, huge news. You overhear another scribe discussing a curious find, an unusually shaped receipt buried near a temple foundation. It was triangular and carved with curses. Turns out it wasn't a transaction at all, but a warning. A threat against anyone who might try to falsify temple records. Basically, the ancient version of, mess with the books and the gods will curse your children's porridge. Weird side note? Some receipts also had duplicates. Mirror copies etched onto second tablets as backups. These would be kept in separate parts of the temple, in case of fire, flood, or petty theft. There were even experiments with hollow tablets, where a copy of the agreement was sealed inside a clay envelope and could only be broken open during disputes. Scribes really hated being questioned, probably still do. At sundown, you're sent to assist an elder scribe with cataloguing receipts from a barley for bronze trade between cities. You begin to realize something remarkable. These dusty tablets don't just record what happened, they show who mattered, who traded with whom, which gods were honored, what the economy valued. You even spot a receipt that mentions a woman by name, Shudatu, brewer of the South Quarter, selling beer barrels to temple laborers. A rare but meaningful appearance of a female merchant in official record. She even had her own seal, shaped like a stylized scorpion. Historians still argue whether women in Mesopotamia had legal rights in trade, or merely informal economic clout. Receipts like Shudatu's hint at more complex gender roles than we usually assume. After all, someone had to manage the breweries, while the men wrote poems about how hot the river goddess looked this spring. By the end of the night, your arms are coated in grayish dust. Your hands ache from stylus pressure. But your mind is buzzing. This isn't just bureaucracy. It's the bones of civilization. Debt, trade, food, law, all fossilized in lines and wedges. Tiny clay echoes of voices, pressed with meaning, kept for posterity. Somewhere between ink and whisper. You wake before dawn to the scratchy sound of someone polishing a seal stone. Again. One of the junior priests is practicing his stamping technique, trying to get the impression of a lion-headed eagle just right. You admire the effort, but it's a bit like someone crinkling chip bags in the next room while you're trying to dream of soft reeds and floating barges. Today, though, there's no sleeping in. You're heading out. Beyond the temple, beyond the city gates, you're accompanying an official scribe on a delivery mission, and not just for paperwork. This time, you're part of the bureaucracy on foot. The temple is sending a shipment of wool and dried fish to a sister city upriver, Lagash, to be exact, and your job is to record the handoff. It's not glamorous, it's not sacred, but it's vital. You march beside ox carts under the baking sun, watching the marshes flicker past in long green lines. Cranes rise in startled flocks. Frogs scatter from the muddy ditches. The air smells like damp reeds, sweat, and whatever someone brought for lunch that's already gone warm in the heat. As you trudge, the lead scribe, an older man named Namti, whose beard is as thick as temple rope, tells you the rules of the road. Never lose the tablet, he grumbles, tapping the sealed clay envelope slung in a reed case over his shoulder. This is the trade record. If we misplace it, the receiving temple will claim we delivered nothing. And if they break the seal before we arrive, we accuse them of theft. Either way, you need the tablet. This isn't a simple memo. It's a trust device, a diplomatic shield. It contains a list of goods, marked with both your temple seal and the receiving city's expected counterseal. It's been fired for durability, unlike most soft clay receipts. You could bash someone over the head with it and still submit it as evidence afterward. And halfway through the trip, a wheel breaks on one of the carts. There's a scramble to offload bundles. One poor porter stumbles into the marsh, chasing a loose jar of fish paste. The smell follows you for miles. You finally arrive in Lagash near sunset. The gates open with that sleepy, creaking reluctance, common to all ancient city-states after a long, hot day. Inside, another temple, another bureaucracy, but slightly different. Lagash likes their scribes in colored robes, apparently, and their courtyards are arranged around sunken pools, with lilies floating on top like forgotten dessert garnishes. You meet the receiving priest, who smells like expensive oil and boredom. He holds out his hand, not for greeting, but for the tablet. Namti places it in his palm like it's a sacred gem. The priest examines the unbroken seal, nods, then takes out his own stylus and clay. Here's where it gets interesting. You're not just giving the goods, you're recording the reception. Both temples will keep a record. That way, if someone lies later, both sides have proof. You write 2 matching tablets, one for them, one for you. Each is stamped with a date, weight of goods, scribe's name, and a short phrase. May the delivery be honest before the gods. A kind of divine signature line. Pretty poetic for a fish and wool order. There's a little ceremony after, a few words muttered toward the setting sun, a puff of incense tossed into a brazier. Nothing dramatic, but just enough to feel official, civilized. You get a night to rest in the outer scribe quarters, and there you discover something wild. One of the local scribes is a collector, not of jewelry or scrolls, but of receipts, specifically weird receipts. He shows you a tablet listing a trade of 1 golden ring for a hairless goat that can bleat songs. You're not sure if it was a joke, a metaphor, or just a strange animal. The tablet's real though, stamped, signed, and preserved. He shows you another, an early attempt at a bilingual receipt. It has cuneiform on one side and Proto-Elamite symbols on the other. Apparently, the transaction involved a traveling merchant who insisted on seeing his own script. It's messy, a bit chaotic, but historically priceless. Historians still debate whether these bilingual records were common or rare experiments. Some argue they were used primarily in border cities. Others say they were limited to high-status trades. Either way, the implications are clear. Mesopotamians weren't isolated. They negotiated with foreigners, adapted language barriers, and treated the clay tablet like a multilingual passport. Before you leave, your collector friend mentions something odd. A legend about a living receipt. Not literally alive. Relax. But a story passed among scribes of a receipt so sacred, so permanent, that it was written on fired clay and tattooed onto a priest's back. A dual record. One to be kept in the archives, the other worn like an eternal bond. The tale is murky. Historians doubt it ever happened. But the idea lingers. You return to your home city by riverboat, drifting through the still waters, while dragonflies skate across the surface like bored ice dancers. The tablet copies are wrapped and stored in a wax-lined case, safe from the splash and wind. Back at the temple, your return is met with the usual bustle. Wheat tallies, livestock rosters, someone yelling about miscounted fish again. But you carry a little more confidence in your step. You've now seen how a receipt travels. Not just across clay, but across cities, languages, expectations. It's a living thread of trust, woven through people who've never met. Later that night, as you light a small oil lamp and crack your knuckles over a fresh practice tablet, you think about something Eternamti said during the trip. "People forget the man who builds the wall," he muttered, "but they remember the tablet that says why the wall was built." That's your job now, not to build the wall or cook the fish or raise the goat that bleats songs, but to hold the why, and you find that oddly comforting. You're back at your familiar desk, fingers caked in dried clay, and your reed stylus is splintering at the tip. It's the kind of exhaustion only record-keeping can bring. The slow mental burn of too many numbers, too many dates, too many fish. Always the fish, but something's changed in you since that journey to Lagash. You've seen how deeply receipts stitch people together, how even far-off temples lean on these little clay promises. It makes the daily grind feel less boring, almost noble, like you're part of some quiet machinery holding the world upright. And now, you're being tested. A minor scandal hits the temple storehouse. 2 receipts for the same batch of barley, but with different dates and different weights. Someone's lying, or worse, skimming. The senior scribe is stomping around the archive, red-faced and muttering about corruption. You, being junior and quiet and available, get assigned to investigate. Congrats! You begin with the tablets. One is softer, freshly made, the other is hardened, probably fired weeks ago. You can feel the difference when you run your fingertips across the surface. The newer one smells faintly of damp reeds. Someone rushed the drying process. The older receipt has a seal you recognize. Eternamtes. The newer one, though, is from a scribe named Calusin. You've never liked Calusin. He talks like he's composing poetry, and his stylus never seems to get dirty. You flip through the trade logs and find a third tablet, a delivery note from the boatmen who brought the barley upstream. It matches the older receipt's date and weight. Interesting. Now comes the tricky part, asking questions without losing your job. You casually bump into Calusin during lunch. Over boiled onions and lentil mash, you ask how he's doing, and whether he's heard about the duplicate barley receipts. "Oh, that," he says, smiling too quickly. "Just a clerical mistake. Nothing important." "Uh-huh." You press gently. Mention the boatman's tablet. His smile fades like a temple mural in the rain. He excuses himself with a hasty mutter about prayer duties and scurries off. Later that night, you sneak back into the tablet's archive with a small oil lamp and a guilty conscience. The shelves are uneven, the air thick with dust and faint mold. You search for one thing, the seal stone used on Calusin's questionable receipt. And sure enough, you find it, hidden in a basket of old styluses. Which is weird, because scribes carry their seals on them like wallets. Always. Unless they don't want it traced. You take the stone, green serpentine with a chipped edge, and press it into soft clay. Then you compare it to the suspicious receipt. Not even close. The edge grooves are wrong. The winged lion on the fake is too squat. The real seal has a tiny scratch through the lion's eye that the fake doesn't. Boom, forgery. You report your findings the next morning. The temple elders are grim but quiet. They don't yell, They don't smile. They just take the fake receipt, snap it in half, and summon Kalus in. He's removed from the scribal ranks that afternoon. No trial, no spectacle, just a quiet disgrace. He'll likely be reassigned to field duty, counting goats under the sun, far from the clay archives he once polished. You feel strange, not proud, not gloating, just aware that this job, this dull, dusty, meticulous job, matters. People rely on what you write. The seals, the tablets, the dates. They're not just symbols. They're trust, frozen in clay. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian scribes held true legal authority, or if they were simply functionaries obeying priestly orders. Some point to tablets like this one, caught in a forgery scandal, as proof that scribes acted like modern notaries. Others insist they were more like glorified stenographers, recording what they were told, with little personal power. But you just cracked a case. That counts for something. Later, as you rest beneath a canopy in the temple courtyard, you watch the shadows of palm leaves dance along the walls. The evening breeze carries the scent of crushed mint and wet clay. One of the elders sits beside you without a word. He's old, silent, wrapped in layers of linen like a scroll that's never meant to be opened. He passes you a new stylus, ivory-tipped, with a fine reed grip, the kind only senior scribes use. You hold it stunned. It's heavier than your old one, more balanced, the kind of tool that doesn't just write receipts, it shapes them, guides them. He doesn't say much, just nods as if to say, now you carry the why. You return to your desk with a quiet sort of electricity humming in your chest. You unroll a new batch of clay and begin stamping the date. Each mark is deliberate, each line a small promise, and somewhere, just outside the city gates, a merchant is preparing a wagon load of jars. Each one will be counted. Each one will have its place. And you'll be here, writing it down. You wake to smoke, not fire, not yet, but the bitter, powdery scent of something burning. Papyrus, maybe. Or incense. Or something worse. You blink and bolt upright from your mat. A panicked shout echoes from beyond the archive door. Then another. You grab your tunic and sprint out into the corridor, feet slapping hard against clay tiles still warm from the previous day's sun. The sky outside is a sickly orange. Over the rooftops of Nippur, you see it, smoke. Real fire now. Thick plumes rising from the lower district. Panic is spreading faster than the flames. You're ushered out with the others. Scribes, clerks, sleepy acolytes clutching their styluses like weapons. Everyone's hands are dusty. Everyone's eyes are wide. Someone screams that the Elamites have breached the gate. Someone else insists it's just an accidental blaze from a cooking fire. Nobody knows. Nobody waits to find out. You stumble into the courtyard, and there it is, the archive. The great clay tablet room, its thick walls, its rows of recessed cubbies, its hundreds, thousands of records, contracts, tax forms, letters, birth logs, property deeds. Every wedge-shaped scratch, every mark of ownership and obligation you've ever known lives in there, and the fire is creeping closer. People scream for water, for order, for mercy. You don't scream, you run back inside. The heat is a wall. Smoke slinks low, swirling near the ceiling. You cough, blink, cough again. The air tastes like scorched cumin and charcoal. You grab tablets, armfuls of them, you don't even know which ones. Just whatever's closest. Contracts stamped in the name of gods. Ration logs. A half-finished beer receipt you wrote last week. You run them to the central basin. Yes, the temple has a reflecting pool. A miracle in this city. You lower the tablets in gently. They hiss. Clay bubbles. And here's the strange part. They survive. It turns out unfired clay tablets dry and crumble over time. But if they're baked, if they're cooked, they last. Thousands of years. The fire consumes the outer walls. The wooden roof beams crack, shriek, collapse inward. You and the other scribes flee one final time. Tablets still warm in your arms. Clothes singed, hair tangled with ash. The temple burns, but the tablets remain. Buried under collapsed brick. hardened in the heat like prehistoric USB drives. You don't know it yet, but that accidental firing will be what saves them. What saves you, really. From vanishing into history, without a trace. Fast forward. Not by minutes, not by hours, by millennia. It's 1849 now. A British traveller named Austin Henry Layard is poking around in the Middle East, brushing dust off broken ziggurats, wearing far too much wool for this climate. He stumbles upon Nineveh's ruins, then others, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and he finds the tablets, hard as stone, cracked but readable, in boxes, in pits, in ash-blackened rooms like the one you just fled. Scholars today still puzzle over the sheer volume of what was preserved. Entire libraries, land deeds, king lists, letters between lovers, inventories of goats. A broken tablet that might be the world's oldest customer complaint. The copper you sent is substandard, and I am angry. They're amazed too by how advanced it all was, how organized. Some argue Mesopotamia had the first bureaucratic state, a civilization glued together not by soldiers or laws, but by receipts. One of the biggest debates? Whether those archives were designed to be fireproof. Some archaeologists think so. They argue that clay rooms with limited airflow, thick stone walls, and recessed shelving all suggest intentional design. Others say it was just luck, that a few good storms and a particularly nasty fire happened to preserve history by accident. Historians still argue whether these fireproof archives were part of the design or a fortunate byproduct of architectural necessity. But you, the exhausted clay-stained scribe from Nippur, would probably just shrug and say, I needed somewhere to keep the tax forms dry. You sit now by a ruined wall. The fire has passed. The smoke is clearing. You cradle a cool tablet in your lap. It bears your mark, your seal, your handwriting. And you wonder, who will read this? Will anyone care about the day-old fish you recorded? The stolen sheep? The half measure of beer? Maybe. Maybe they'll find you someday? In a museum, under glass. A tiny wedge on a tiny square, telling the world that once there was a person who counted things, who wrote them down, who made order from chaos, and that against all odds and fire and time, that person was heard. The sun rises cautiously over Nippur, as if unsure whether the city is still standing. You sit cross-legged by the temple ruins, soot-streaked and blistered, surrounded by the quiet crackle of smouldering beams. A faint wind sifts through the debris, lifting ash like powdery snowflakes. You brush your fingers over a tablet resting in your lap. Still warm, still intact. You made this, you saved it. And now the real work begins. Because in Mesopotamia, record-keeping isn't just a daily duty. It's a cultural obsession. A city might fall, a temple might collapse. But as long as someone writes it down, carves it in clay, it happened. You gather the other scribes, all coughing and bleary-eyed, but alive. You count who's missing. You don't say their names out loud. Instead, you open a fresh slab of clay, still damp from the river, and you begin to write. The date, the fire, the damage, the loss. Receipts for memory. The rebuilding starts with logs. Literally, timber shipments, brick inventories, ration distributions. You record who gets how many workers, how many bushels of grain, who owes whom for what. The city's chaos becomes, slowly, a new kind of order, built one wedge at a time. And now, you're not just a scribe, you're a witness. You document the compensation payments made to families who lost homes. You list the tools distributed from the armory. You file new contracts between landowners and displaced tenant farmers. At some point, you even record a receipt for the fire itself. How many bricks were recovered? How many beams lost? How many buckets borrowed in the panic? You might laugh if you weren't so tired. A receipt for a disaster, very on brand. But this is what gives Mesopotamian bureaucracy its oddly comforting rhythm. Nothing is too grand or too grim to be tallied. Here's a quirky example. One tablet from Lagash describes compensation paid to a goat herder whose animals got trampled by a royal parade. Another notes that a shipment of onions was downgraded because they smelled offensive. And yes, there's even one that logs a temple worker's request for 2 jars of perfume and a replacement wig. Priorities. Back in your newly rebuilt scriptorium, you organize the tablets by theme: rations, labor, legal disputes, livestock, divine offerings. You slide them into shelves made of brick and wood. Each shelf is labeled, each row indexed by clay tags pressed with small rope handles. The whole system feels oddly modern, and while most of your receipts are practical, some feel personal, like the small tablet you find tucked behind a brick, unsigned, but obviously from a junior scribe. It simply reads, "I dream of copying things forever." You leave it where it is. Meanwhile, the temple authorities start requesting specific tablets more often, usually to resolve property disputes or divine omens. They ask you to retrieve the tablet recording the boundary of a barley field sold 23 years ago. You find it within minutes. You feel a small flicker of pride. That barley is still there. The man who sold it might not be. One day, a priest brings you a lump of badly damaged clay and asks if it can be read. You squint, adjust the light. Slowly, like someone piecing together a forgotten recipe, you start to decipher the wedge marks. It's a receipt for 10 loaves of date bread and 2 jugs of honey beer from nearly 60 years ago. He chuckles and says, "Well, I suppose someone still owes us lunch." You both laugh. Historians today marvel at the scope of Mesopotamian record-keeping. Over 500,000 tablets have been discovered, and that's just what survived. Most are receipts, mundane, formulaic, wonderfully boring, but they give us one of the clearest pictures of ancient daily life anywhere in the world. And here's a little-known tidbit. Scholars often identify individual scribes by their handwriting. Some wedge strokes are broader, others tighter, or unusually tilted. There's even debate over whether left-handed scribes were common. One theory suggests you might have been one. Your lines always slope slightly upward and left. Charming, really. Historians still argue whether this vast scribal infrastructure was primarily religious or administrative. Was it about pleasing the gods or pleasing the tax collectors? You'd say probably both. The gods like receipts too. And somewhere in the stacks, a small clay rectangle bears a quiet, slightly lopsided mark. Your mark. A symbol you've pressed hundreds of times, with practiced pressure and just enough flair to distinguish it from your colleagues. In that moment, it feels like permanence, like being remembered not as a name shouted in war or sung in epic, but as a steady hand who knew how to count barley properly. Outside, children run past the scorched temple walls, chasing each other with sticks. The city is healing, slowly, brick by brick, word by word, receipt by receipt. You take a breath and reach for another tablet. The sun hangs lower now, slanting gold across the Euphrates, as if it too is easing into retirement. You sit by the riverbank, feet dangling just above the water, watching reed boats float lazily past. Time feels stretched out, longer, quieter. And yet, history moves on. You blink once, maybe twice, and suddenly centuries slip through your fingers like sand. Empires fall, names change. Clay gives way to something thinner, lighter, and somehow even more fragile. Papyrus. You're in Egypt now, or something like it. The air is drier, the language thicker, but the itch to document, to tally, to preserve, oh, it's stronger than ever. The Mesopotamians may have perfected the receipt, but the Egyptians turned it into an art. Where you once pressed wet clay with a reed stylus, they now paint delicate black symbols across long scrolls of sun-dried plant pulp. You squint at one as it's unrolled before you. A list of linen deliveries to a temple, complete with the name of the linen weaver and the exact weight in Deben. Very on brand again. But here's the twist. Unlike clay tablets, papyrus is portable. You can carry 10 scrolls in one hand, slip them into a sleeve, toss them into a satchel. Receipts evolve from clay-bound permanence to something more mobile, more human-scaled. Paperwork, quite literally, takes flight. And yet, not everyone's impressed. You meet an old Babylonian scholar, grizzled, bitter, missing 2 fingers, who scoffs at the change. Papyrus burns, he mutters. Clay survives. He's not wrong. But even he carries a papyrus ledger tucked inside his robe. A reluctant convert. Historians still argue whether Egypt truly invented papyrus receipts or simply adapted the Mesopotamian system to fit their own style. The lines between borrowing and innovating are always a little blurred. What's clear is that they took record-keeping seriously. Taxes in Egypt? Oh, honey, they taxed everything. Land, cattle, grain, fish, even cooking oil. Every transaction left a paper trail, sometimes literally. Want to marry someone? That's a receipt. Buying sandals? Receipt. Sacrificing to a hippo-headed goddess? Yep, still a receipt. You sit in a dusty market square, watching a scribe write up a complaint from a potter who claims his clay was stolen by his neighbor's goat. It's elegant, absurd, timeless, and the beauty of it is, some of these receipts survived, buried in jars, stuffed in tombs, folded between temple records. Scholars today pore over them like sacred texts. One particularly juicy document details a corrupt official skimming grain from tax collections and the furious receipt that exposed him. The ancient world had whistleblowers too. Here's a fun fact. Some receipts were so important, they were duplicated. Triple copies even. One for the buyer, one for the seller, and one for the temple. And just like today, people lost them. Then came in shouting, "I paid that goat tax, I swear I did." The clerk, unfazed, reaches under the counter, pulls out a scroll. "Do you have the original receipt?" he asks. "Nope, no refund." You wander further, finding echoes of your old world in each Egyptian record. Dates carefully logged, weights standardized, signatures added in looping script, and even a return policy. One tablet, scroll, mentions a man who returned a defective bronze razor only to be charged a restocking fee. You smirk, capitalism's baby teeth. What's more curious, though, is how the idea of the receipt spreads. Not just across regions, but across purposes. In Mesopotamia, receipts were mostly economic. But here in Egypt, they start slipping into the social and spiritual. You find a document listing a dowry, a detailed account of linens, cattle, perfumes, and even a slave girl named Small Joy. It reads like a shopping list, but it's also a symbol of union, of alliance, of complicated human emotion. In a way, it's a receipt for love, or, at least, for marriage. Further on, a priest shows you a scroll recording temple offerings, incense, honey, fruit, wine. But there's a margin note. Small, almost hidden. Smell of figs too weak. Even the gods get picky. And there's this odd, delightful fringe theory that some Egyptian scribes included little jokes in the margins of official receipts. A doodle of a cat chasing a fish. A pun on the word deben, which also sounds like the word for tooth. Scholars argue over whether these were common or just rogue scribes being cheeky. You decide to believe in the rogue scribe. He seems fun. As the sun dips below the horizon, the Nile flickers with orange and violet. You lean back, scroll resting on your chest, and think about how far receipts have come. From token-filled clay balls to feather-light papyrus curls. Each stage has brought new quirks, new headaches, and new ways to lose track of your last payment. And the most astonishing thing? It's not over. This isn't the end of receipts. It's just another draft. You, sitting in the gathering dark, are merely a comma in the longest footnote of human accountability. So rest your eyes for a moment. Because soon the story will shift again. New tools, new empires, new scribes. But for now, you let the scroll slip from your fingers and drift gently into that soft, paper-scented dusk. By the time you open your eyes again, the scroll is gone, and so is the Nile. In its place, dust, Wind and a new kind of noise, lighter, sharper, the clack of abacus beads, the scratch of charcoal on thin parchment. You're not in Egypt anymore. You're in a merchant stall in ancient China, somewhere along the Silk Road, maybe Dunhuang or Chang'an, depending on which dusty sign you believe. You're surrounded by silk bolts, lacquered bowls, spices in clay jars, and most importantly, ledgers. Receipts, you discover, have been reborn once again. This time, they're written with bamboo brushes, on paper so thin it flutters when someone exhales too hard. But make no mistake, this isn't artistic whimsy. It's bureaucracy with teeth. This paper isn't for poems. It's for business. The merchant across from you, a man with 2 long fingernails and exactly 0 smiles, is tallying your purchases. Cinnamon, dried ginger, a robe that you think might be magenta, but the lighting's weird. He hands you a sliver of paper with looping characters and a stamped red seal. You try to read it. It's mostly numbers, and one angry-looking symbol you're pretty sure means "do not return." Congratulations, that's your receipt. The Chinese bureaucracy, especially under the Han and later the Tang dynasty, was one of the most advanced in ancient history. Everything was recorded. Land deeds, tax records, grain exchanges, and even silk quotas. If you made a living in commerce, chances are your hands were always ink-stained. And don't think these receipts were simple. Some included up to 4 seals, 1 from the buyer, 1 from the seller, 1 from the local magistrate, and 1 from the tax clerk. It was less of a receipt and more like a tiny treaty. Lose it, and good luck proving you paid your silk tax. Historians still argue whether the rise of receipts in China was purely a domestic development or influenced in part by older systems from Mesopotamia and India. The Silk Road was a superhighway of not just goods, but ideas, and it's entirely possible that some clever bureaucrat borrowed a Sumerian concept and gave it a makeover with a calligraphy brush. But receipts didn't just exist for commerce. In one old monastery, a scholar shows you a peculiar piece of parchment. It's a donation slip, issued by monks to wealthy patrons who gifted rice or incense. Not only did it note the amount, but it included blessings and, cheekily, a promise to pray on their behalf at least twice daily. Spiritual receipts, if you will. A holy transaction log. Meanwhile, in the marketplace, you overhear 2 women arguing over whether a tea seller gave them the wrong grade of leaves. One slams down her receipt. The seller squints at it and shakes his head. "Wrong stall," he says. A crowd gathers. Someone fans themselves with their own receipt. Because yes, they're wide enough to double as makeshift fans. Multifunctional paper. Take that, clay tablets. As you wander deeper into the city, you spot something strange. Tiny bamboo slips bound together with twine. You realize it's a multi-page receipt log, used by an official to track incoming and outgoing shipments. Each slip contains a line or 2, written vertically, documenting weights, names, dates. You flick through it like a Rolodex. It's oddly satisfying. And there's a fringe theory you come across. Whispers among scholars that some of these bamboo logs were encoded using early cipher systems to prevent forgery. A sort of ancient receipt encryption. Do we have proof? Not really. But we want it to be true, don't we? Later, you sit in the back of a counting house, watching scribes perform calculations with abacuses while scribbling figures with shocking speed. The air is thick with lamp smoke and the dried, dusty scent of ink blocks. One scribe even licks his brush before writing, an ancient habit that sends a shiver down your spine. That can't be sanitary. But the math checks out. Every transaction is logged twice. Once in the buyer's ledger, once in the state's archive. You realize this is not just about bookkeeping. It's about trust. Receipts here function not just as proof, but as reassurance. You did the thing. You paid the tax. You gave the offering. And now, here's the slip that says so. The system is beautiful in its paranoia. You pass a public notice board plastered with old receipts, Some faded, some torn. A few are marked with red symbols for disputed. Others have comments scrawled in the margins. You wonder if some petty merchant started this as a passive-aggressive protest. Maybe receipts are also a way of talking back. The night air cools as the lanterns begin to glow. You sit cross-legged on a woven mat, receipt in hand, and marvel at how far you've come. From clay tablets in the heat of Uruk to paper scrolls under the Tang moonlight, the simple act of saying, "I did this, I paid that," has taken on a dozen forms, each more inventive and weirdly human than the last. And here, just before we close the book, you realize something. It's not really about money or grain or goats. It's about memory. A receipt is just a fragile, hopeful way of not being forgotten, of proving that you existed in a moment, that you mattered enough to leave a trace. So you let your head rest against the scrolls, the paper cool against your cheek, and listen to the scratch of ink one last time. And now, the ink fades. The quills stop scratching. The scrolls roll themselves back into silence. The ledger closes with a gentle sigh. You lie there, somewhere between parchment and dream, letting the centuries peel away like rice paper in the rain. The merchants are gone. The scribes have put away their brushes. Even the gods, once demanding offerings and documented incense, have gone quiet for the night. The world softens. The stars blink on, one by one, over Mesopotamia, over Egypt, over China's winding trade routes. Every ancient receipt, every little seal and scrawl and squiggly mark, that was someone, somewhere, saying, "This happened. I was here, and now you're here too." Maybe you didn't bring any barley to the temple. Maybe you never got a refund for that defective fish. But you witnessed it all. You followed the paper trail back through history, through reed styluses and sun-dried ink, all the way to this still moment. So take a deep breath. Let your limbs grow heavy, like papyrus under warm stone. Let your thoughts flutter like paper in a quiet archive. You don't have to remember it all. Somewhere, it's already been recorded. You paid your dues, you told your story, the receipt is filed. And now, it's time to rest. Sweet dreams.